Welcome back to the Everything History podcast for episode 39, The Reign of Augustus. This will be the last episode I do on the great Augustus Caesar, formerly known as Gaius Octavianus Caesar.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Now, as I said at the end of the previous episode, if you're interested in hearing about the art and architecture built during Augustus' reign, I recommend episode 31. That includes the Pantheon, the city of Nicopolis, the Mausoleum of Augustus, and much more. Actually, now that I think about it, we didn't really talk about the Pantheon of Agrippa, or his Odeon in Athens, or Caesar's massive mausoleum. We mainly discussed artistic movements, the Temple of Divine Julius Caesar, and how Augustus used art and architecture to project himself, his ideas, and his agenda. Now, all that stuff is very interesting, but this episode is about history, the nuts and bolts of what happened during the reign of Augustus Caesar, not art history. I'll start back at the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra. After his victory, Augustus formally put an end to the Ptolemaic dynasty and any sense of Egyptian independence, including the end of the pharaohs. For Augustus made Egypt a province. In fact, he made it his own personal province. The age of Hellenism and the Hellenistic kingdoms that took place after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE was officially at an end, and the age of empire began. This relegation of Egypt to an imperial province fully subjugated the Roman East and also added a great amount of wealth to the empire. Perhaps most important pragmatically was the secured addition of Egypt's grain supply every year. Moving on, much of what Augustus did in his reign was problem solving. Almost all of these problems were left over from the Republic. The Senate in the Republican system had not been able to properly manage a whole host of affairs, one such problem being the Roman provincial system. The problem with the Roman provinces was multi-layered. You see, in the Republic, Rome had expanded in an odd manner. Rome had not truly desired to expand. In fact, they really didn't want to. And when they had, it had been almost entirely for defensive purposes. They conquered Italia in order to protect themselves. They defeated Carthage and finally subjugated them after 3 wars. The same story holds true for the Roman takeover of Greece, Macedonia, and Hispania. Asia, as in Asia Minor, was gifted to them in 133 BCE, and the expansions thereafter had been products of power and ambition, the usual motivations for conquer throughout history. These later areas include Judea, Gaul, Illyria, Libya, and many smaller territories. Now, all this change in territory had occurred over a matter of centuries, and the Romans had not truly adapted well. The Senate had managed the provinces poorly, and governors tended to collude, rebel, or grow corrupt. Sometimes there was just a constant lack of control, like in Hispania. Hispania is often referred to as the graveyard of the Roman Republic because of the constant warfare the Romans had to conduct in order to maintain control. So long story short, the Roman provinces were a relative shit show when Augustus led Rome into the imperial period. Augustus saw the first step in straightening out the provinces as defense. He believed, correctly, that the provinces needed secure borders in order to institute true change and protect Rome. That is easier said than done, however, and it took Augustus nearly his entire reign to create defensible borders. To the south, Augustus secured Africa with a single legion, and the loyalty of Mauritania's client kings and rulers, but the true protection came from the Sahara Desert. Northern Africa would never trouble Rome as it once had during the time of the Carthaginians and Phoenicians. The west was secured thanks to complete control of the coastline, but the east and the northern borders required unique approaches. The east had been scarred by failed Roman invasions into Parthia, and Augustus had no intention of campaigning there. He really had no intention of campaigning anywhere. So Caesar negotiated a treaty with the Parthians that secured not only peace, but the lost Roman standards of Crassus. This was a great victory for Caesar, and he accomplished it through diplomacy. To the north, Augustus was required to be more aggressive. To create a defendable border region, Caesar sought to expand to the Danube River that stretched across Central and Eastern Europe and to the Elbe River in modern-day Germany. The hope was that the Elbe-Danube border would be easier to defend than the Rhine-Danube line, and a Roman province in the Germanic areas could stifle barbaric militarization and invasion attempts in the future. This was a difficult task, however, and took several decades. Eventually, through the leadership of Caesar's stepsons and relatives, Tiberius, Drusus, and Germanicus, Rome successfully reached both the Danube and the Elbe. Augustus even planned to create a new province entitled Germania in the new German territories, but betrayal and disaster struck. The newly appointed governor of Germania, General Lucius Verus, was led into a trap in modern-day Lower Saxony. The trap was set by Arminius, a Roman soldier from German roots who sought to become king of the Germanic tribes. Verus and his 3 legions were slaughtered. 20,000 men vanished from history. This was the disastrous Battle of Teutoburg Forest, and it occurred in 9 CE. Thereafter, Augustus was distraught and pulled back the frontier to the Rhine River, where it would remain for centuries. Despite the disaster at Teutoburg, Augustus had succeeded in securing the Roman borders, and as he officially settled the frontiers of the Principate, he also had to figure out what to do with the armies. This was also a problem left over from the Republic. The problem being, as I should explain, what should Rome do with its armies in times of peace? Well, the best solution prior to Augustus had been to keep them busy in warfare. As you might imagine, though, that's a flawed design, and Augustus intended to create an era of peace, which he did. This era is known as the Pax Augusta, Augustan peace, and part of the Pax Romana. So Augustus created a new system to manage the military. It is commonly referred to as the shell defense system. In this system, the legions of Rome were placed on the frontiers, the bulk being placed along the Rhine and Danube, with several legions spread out across the eastern reaches, and he often rotated the armies so they would not stay in one place too long. This shell defense design served several purposes. It secured the borders from possible invasions and threats, it kept the legions occupied, and perhaps most importantly, it kept the army far away and out of politics. And while I'm at it, I'll explain how Augustus restructured the army itself. Caesar did not make any changes to the command or legion structure, at least not significant changes, but he did adjust legion recruitment and the manner in which the soldiers were paid. Since Gaius Marius, circa 100 BCE, Roman armies had been volunteer armies, but they had been loyal to their generals, often only serving for single campaigns, and received their pay at variable times and usually via spoils of war. Augustus himself had benefited from this system, but as emperor he wanted to simplify the system and prevent any other ambitious senators and generals from gaining power as he had. So he made soldiering a career and designed a professional army that still relied on volunteers. Soldiers were to be paid an annual salary of 225 denarii, and if a Roman served for 17 years, then the soldier could retire with a bonus of 3,000 denarii or a piece of land. And in order to maintain control over leadership, Augustus often had his close relations lead the armies. These included, of course, Marcus Agrippa, Tiberius, Drusus, and Germanicus, all of whom were within the Julio-Claudian family. Now, I need to shift back to the provinces. Due to the other efforts I have just detailed, Augustus could also successfully now change the administration and bureaucratic structure of the provinces. For distant and difficult to manage provinces, Caesar allowed client kings to rule, like Herod the Great and Juba II. The rest of the provinces Augustus divided between himself and the Senate, known as imperial and senatorial provinces. The only province exempt from such divisions was Italia, which was managed independently without oversight. The senatorial provinces included southern Hispania, Sicily, Narbonese Gaul, Greece, and Asia. Northern Hispania, Gaul, Illyria, Syria, and Egypt were under the control of Augustus. In the senatorial domains, provinces were governed by proconsuls, one per province. And officials known as the legates of Augustus governed in the imperial provinces. Yet despite this example of apparent senatorial control over at least some of the territories, however, if Caesar desired, he could supersede any and all such officials, including the entire Senate, although Caesar rarely exercised this power. Furthermore, in all 25 provinces, Augustus created a network of civil servants. These are often referred to as provincial bureaucrats. They included tax collectors, procurators, prefects, and decurions. Most of these positions were restricted to freedmen or equestrians, and one of the rewards for being a loyal civil servant was often Roman citizenship. Speaking of Roman bureaucracy and citizenship, Augustus also completely reorganized Roman social structure too. Well, completely is too strong, but he did indeed reorganize the stratification of Roman society. And yes, Roman society was always very stratified, and the difference between important people and the rest was always very clear. What made these differences changed over time, though. By the time of Augustus' death in 14 CE, the social structure was as follows. Roman citizens were divided between senators, equestrians, and plebeians. And yes, that was in descending order of status, and the difference between these citizen classes was primarily wealth. And that was a change that Augustus made. Among the non-citizens there were provincials and slaves, but in between citizens and non-citizens there was a class of people known as the freedmen, who were not citizens but still nonetheless outranked non-citizens. And a big change that Augustus institutionalized was the fact that it was now easier to move up the social hierarchy if you were a good Roman, but it was also fairly easy to get demoted down the social ladder as well. For example, if you were some random barbarian, you could join the Roman army as an auxiliary soldier, serve for 25 years, and gain Roman citizenship to become a plebeian, which is a nice success story. But say you were a Roman senator and you decided to marry the love of your life, but she was a provincial. Well, in that case, either your wife would have to do something exceptional and become a Roman citizen, or all your children would be born as non-citizen freedmen. The system was designed in such a way and tweaked by Caesar in order to make Roman citizenship and Roman culture valuable assets to be had. And that's also a great opportunity for me to segue into explaining Augustus' impact on Roman culture and the doctrine of Romanization. Specifically, I want to cover Roman literature during his reign. In fact, this era is known as the Golden Age of Roman literature, and Augustus was the chief patron of the writings. The authors include Horace, Ovid, Virgil, Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and many more lesser-known authors. Most of these writers were recruited by Augustus' advisor Maecenas in order to intentionally produce great literature that portrayed not only the greatness of Rome, but the greatness of Augustus himself. The works include Virgil's Georgics and the Aeneid, Livy's massive history of Rome, Dionysius' Roman Antiquities, and Ovid's The Metamorphoses. These works also made use of subtext and cultural undertones in order to highlight Roman tradition, honorable professions such as farming, and sometimes the writings even contained hidden moments of adultery, for which one author, Ovid, was famously banished to an island in the Black Sea by Caesar himself. As an aside, Augustus also passed a series of laws in an attempt to curb adultery and lecherous behavior in Roman society. Despite the threat of high punishment, these efforts were largely unsuccessful, even within Augustus' own family. And as for Romanization, one of the best facilitating factors of Roman culture was actually the army on the borders of the Roman Empire. For anybody that came into the empire was greeted with the army, and many people beyond the empire could in fact join the army as auxiliary forces. And many of these migrants could join the Roman army in the process of Romanization and thereby learn Roman culture, beginning by learning the language, of course, Latin and probably Greek as well. Before I get to the exciting and somewhat conspiratorial matters of succession, let's turn now for a few moments to currency, the economy, and religion. In terms of religion, Caesar did not make any adjustments, although he certainly promoted Greco-Roman myths, believing personally that many of the Greek myths were great teaching tools. Something he did change, or add I should say, is the cult of Rome and Augustus. Random cults to random gods and goddesses had a proud history throughout the Greco-Roman world, and Augustus added to this the imperial cult, the cult of Rome and Augustus. Romans were compelled to drop incense into a fire on an altar to Rome and the emperor. In reality, this had nothing to do with worship, but with loyalty. Augustus hoped that a periodic symbol of devotion and loyalty to the state and to the emperor, whomever it may be, would rub off on the people. It may have, but it is impossible to tell. Think of the imperial cult and the mandatory offerings, if you're American, in the same sense of the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, currency, and by that I mean coinage, also changed slightly as well under Augustus. Roman coinage is notoriously complex, and it changed frequently over the long history of Rome. By the time Augustus formed the Principate, Roman coinage was firmly set between gold, silver, and copper. The chief coins of each metal respectively were the aureus, the denarius, and the as. Gold coins were rarely ever seen or used outside of treasuries, and the Roman economy functioned around silver and copper. Most daily purchases were likely conducted through copper or through exchange. But the staple money of Rome was the silver denarius, or its lesser form, the sestertii. All other coinage was based in proportion to the denarius. In other words, the denarius was akin to the American dollar or British pound, and so on. Augustus did not meddle with the coinage much, although he did centralize the minting process so that the emperor, if he so desired, had full control when coinage was minted or reminted and what designs were to appear on the coins. Speaking of the economy, the Roman world was almost entirely agricultural, with approximately 80 to 90% of the population being involved in agricultural enterprises. Caesar also conducted several empire-wide censuses, which I will get to later when I touch on Augustus' autobiography. But right now, I can finally address the Augustan Succession, arguably the most interesting set of decisions and intrigue within Caesar's reign as emperor. The phrase Augustan Succession refers to the process and history around Caesar's choice for who might succeed him. This was a very difficult decision process for Augustus, so much so that he even pondered giving the Senate back control. And although he did not choose that route, I would certainly say he left the door open for the Senate, but they simply didn't take the initiative. More on that later. So who did Augustus choose, and why was the process hard? Well, early in his reign, before the inauguration of the second settlement even, he chose his nephew Marcellus, his sister's son, who was a very respectable young Roman leader. But Marcellus died in 23 BCE at the age of 19. So next, Augustus turned to his long-term friend Marcus Agrippa. The two were staunch allies, and after the creation of the second settlement, Caesar even had the Senate give proconsular imperium and the power of a tribune to Agrippa. Thus, for all intents and purposes, by 14 BCE or so, Agrippa had full imperial power. And that is how Augustus showed his indication for succession, by giving his choice successor all of his powers as well. And he also made it practice to adopt his successor as his son. Sadly, Agrippa died at the age of 51 in 12 BCE. Caesar was so aggrieved by Agrippa's death that he went into mourning for an entire month, and he had him buried in his own mausoleum for the Julio-Claudians. Third of his choices were his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Augustus had personally helped raise them, and they were very young, so this looked like the safe bet. But alas, tragedy struck once more. Gaius and Lucius died in mysterious circumstances. Lucius died in 2 CE at the age of 19, and Gaius in 4 CE at the age of 24. Now, Augustus's last choice was Tiberius, his stepson by his long-term wife Livia Drusilla before their marriage. Yet Augustus had never liked Tiberius, and thought him unfit for imperial administration. In fact, Caesar even preferred Tiberius' brother Drusus, but he too had died at the age of 29 before even Gaius and Lucius had perished. So finally, Augustus had to settle on Tiberius as his successor, even though he was technically his 6th choice. So Caesar formally adopted both Tiberius and Tiberius' son Germanicus, and shared his powers regrettably with Tiberius. Caesar hoped that by adopting both of them, that a clear line of succession would be shown even after Tiberius, and Germanicus was indeed a very well-liked Roman and an exceptional commander. Tiberius too had been a very talented military leader, but Germanicus would die shortly after Augustus, at the age of 33, also under mysterious circumstances. Now I detailed and listed Caesar's succession difficulties in order to emphasize how all of his choices died, most of them in young adulthood. You might explain this away by noting that most Romans did not live all that long. This is true, of course, but life expectancy is misleading in the ancient world because of the very high number of early deaths during birth or childhood. But if a Roman lived to adulthood, they could expect to reach at least 45-50 years of age. And if you were from a family like the Julio-Claudians, then you ought to reach the ripe old age of 60 or 70. But, as you heard, 4 out of Augustus's 5 initial choices had died before the age of 30, and 3 before the age of 25, and 2 of them before the age of 20. These anomalies of tragedy are therefore suspicious. The ancient historians too were very suspicious, and Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and many lesser-known writers accused Livia, Caesar's wife, of being involved in at least a few of the deaths. The motive, they assert, was to get her son Tiberius to succeed her husband. There is no direct evidence, but Livia certainly had the personality for it. She was known to be treacherous, conniving, and often meddling in Augustus's designs. It is also by her own admission that Livia hinted several times at intentionally not having children by Augustus by intentionally causing stillbirths or taking certain medicines early on in order to abort the pregnancies. I personally believe quite strongly that she was involved with at least one of the untimely deaths, especially considering the fact that Tiberius really did not even want to be emperor. By his own admission, the man hated politics and the responsibilities his mother forced him to bear, so much so that Tiberius spent almost all of his rule isolated on the island of Capua. Yet, once more, all of this is based on hearsay, and, in one way or another, Tiberius did succeed Augustus, and the Senate gave him full control, and he reigned from 14 to 37 CE. That brings this series of episodes on Augustus Caesar near to a close, and I want to conclude with excerpts from Caesar's own autobiography, the Res Gestae Divi Augusti. And note in his words that Caesar will dictate population numbers, but keep in mind that those numbers do not include non-citizens, and non-citizens made up the majority of the Roman population. Also, this was written by Caesar himself, which is pretty cool, and the style of it is that he is basically reeling off all the stuff he's done, and he's actually being quite succinct. And I quote, "At the age of 19, on my own initiative and at my own expense, I raised an army by the means of which I restored liberty to the Republic. For which service the Senate enrolled me in its order, giving me consular precedence. It also gave me the imperium. Those who slew my father I drove into exile, punishing their deed by due process of the law, and afterwards, when they waged war on the Republic, I twice defeated them in battle. Wars, both civil and foreign, I undertook throughout the world, on sea and land, and when victorious, I spared all citizens who sued for pardon. The number of Roman citizens who bound themselves to me by military oath was about 500,000. Twice I celebrated the ovation, thrice I celebrated triumphs, and was saluted as imperator 21 times. Although the Senate decreed upon me more triumphs, I set them aside. In my triumphs there were 9 kings or children of kings led before me. At the time of writing this, I have been 13 times consul, and in my 37th year of tribunician power. The dictatorship was offered to me by the people and the Senate, and I did not accept. I freed the people from a great scarcity of grain from my own supply. The consulship for life or annually I did not accept either. I refused to accept any power offered to me which was contrary to the traditions of our ancestors. For 10 years in succession, I was one of the triumvirs for the re-establishment of the Constitution. To this day, I have been princeps senatus for 40 years. As consul for the 5th time, I increased the number of patricians. In my 6th consulship, with Marcus Agrippa as my colleague, I made a census of the people. 4,063,000 Roman citizens were entered on the census roll. In the consulship of Censorinus and Asinius, I performed the census a 2nd time. 4,233,000 Roman citizens were entered on the roll. A 3rd time, with my son Tiberius Caesar, 4,937,000 Roman citizens were enrolled. The Senate decreed that every 5 years, vows should be taken for my health by the consuls and priests. In addition, all citizens performed continued sacrifices for my health at all altars of the gods. The temple of Janus Quirinus, which our ancestors ordered to be closed whenever there was peace, secured by victory throughout the whole domain of the Roman people on land and sea, which, before my birth, had been closed but twice since the foundation of the city. The Senate ordered to be closed thrice while I was princeps. I paid 600 million sestertii for estates in Italia and 260 million sestertii for land in the provinces on which land I assigned the soldiers. I also paid cash gratuities to the soldiers, and for this purpose I expended 400 million sestertii as an act of grace. 4 times I aided the public treasury with an amount in the manner of 150 million sestertii, and I contributed 170 million sestertii to the military treasury." End quote. I interrupt here just because if you cannot tell already, Caesar was loaded with almost boundless amounts of money. And he continues, quote, "Whenever taxes were erroneous, I furnished the difference in either grain or money, sometimes to more than 100,000 persons. I built temples to Mars the Avenger, Jupiter Maximus Apollo, the divine Julius Caesar my father, to Quirinus, Minerva, Juno, Jupiter Libertas, the Augustan Forum, the Basilica Julii, finished the Julian Forum, the Theatre of Marcellus, the Grove of the Caesars, my mausoleum, and much more. I freed the seas from pirates, I extended the boundaries of all provinces, and reduced all to a state of peace. Embassies were often sent from the kings of India, a thing never before seen. and our friendship was sought by all, including the Bastarnae, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Albini, the Heberi, the Parthians, and the Medes. I took precedence above all Romans in rank, but of power I possessed no more than my magisterial colleagues. The Senate, the equestrian class, and the entire Roman people gave to me the title of Pater Patriae, Father of the Country. At the time of writing this, I was 76 years old. End quote, and trust me, his Res Gestae is quite a bit longer. And with that, this concludes the history of Gaius Octavianus Caesar Augustus, a man who was Imperator, Pater Patriae, Pontifex Maximus, Triumvir, Augur, Censor, Praetor, Proaedle, Consul, Princeps Senatus, Paterfamilias of the Julii, and a man who was made a god by the Roman Senate upon his death.
Thank you very much.